Hello, for any of you I've not met, there's quite a lot of people I haven't met. My name is Andrew, as it says on the screen. This is one of many, many pets that I have, Felix. You may know me from a previous Bristol JS talk where I flew slightly larger drones, and I think I may have cut someone's hair with them slightly. That was last year. Or you may know me via my rabbits. Here they are forming a miniature conga line, Bertie and Bluebell. And my latest addition to my lineup is Mabel the Poodle. She hasn't done anything exciting yet, but I'm waiting eagerly for whenever that happens so that I can become famous on the internet. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about exploring open source dependencies based on a side project that I've been working on for the past 6 months or so, on and off evenings, whenever I get access to the internet, which in Shepton Mallet currently there is no internet. Having moved there 2 weeks ago, I've been kind of completely offline, and it's just a horrible way to live. So, how can we start this? The best way, I guess, is to talk about dependencies as they're pretty brilliant, basically. I think that the world of software in the past few years has kind of been able to accelerate massively, in part due to the amount of open source dependencies and libraries that are available for people to use and to build on top of. We can basically accelerate the speed of development by reusing code that people have already written, and they've made accessible and easy to use and to build on top of. We're essentially standing on the shoulders of giants. We don't need to, every time we want to talk to a web service, we don't need to write our own XML parser. We can just go to a previously existing XML parser and go, excellent, I can just use this. I can get on with actually implementing and building new, interesting functionality that's valuable rather than rebuilding and reworking the same things over and over again. And the world of JavaScript has taken this on massively. These counts were from earlier today, so there's probably more than that now. The amount of different libraries that are available to JavaScript developers is just mind-blowing. It's everything you could think of. If you're thinking, I need to solve this problem with software, probably someone's already done it, and they've probably posted it online as a module that you're able to build on top of, unless it's literally the nubbin of their business, and then they've probably kept that as the one piece of code which they've not released. Partly because then other people can contribute and improve those shared pieces of code. The things that aren't quite so interesting aren't necessarily valuable to the business to keep them private, but opening them up means that they can let that code kind of grow and become its own thing that other people can use, which in turn benefits them in a number of ways, like hiring, like actually helping them promote themselves as a tech company, and just giving back on top of the work that they've built on top of, because often these modules don't stand alone. They build on top of other open source libraries, which we can go all the way back down to Linux as an open source system. Most of us probably deploy onto Linux machines, which are all open source, and there's open source libraries built into that. So it's turtles all the way down. But there is a slight problem that we've started to run into, which is literally there are thousands and thousands of modules to choose from. Often exactly there's more than one choice for any particular problem that you have. Up to, there could be thousands of very similar libraries that for solving a particular problem that do it in a very subtly different way. And it's really become, especially in the JavaScript world, quite difficult to decide which library should I use for this particular problem. I guess when there was less choice, you would essentially be like, well, it's very obvious. I can see there's literally only one library that solves this particular problem, so I'll use that one, or I'll write it myself. Now, it's like, there's 100 different things here. I can't decide. should I just try using one of them, or should I write one myself rather than try 5 and fail in the process? This particular module drove me slightly nuts. It's very subtle. It's very nice. The end result with NPM and with the module called download. So it's a very confusing name, but it's not download NPM and install it. It's literally a module called download, which lets you download arbitrary files. But this is the whole dependency tree for that one particular module. Don't even try and read all of the things, because this graph actually overlays text on top of each other. There's that many dependencies, you can't read how many there are. But that is kind of ridiculous. But on the face of it, that actually looked like quite a good library. Like, if you just read the README, you'd think, okay, this thing looks fine. But when you install it and it drops 200 megabytes of JavaScript into your node modules folder, then, and you don't even realize that, because who goes and looks at the sides of their node modules folder as they're developing away? It's only when you deploy and you realize npm install is taking me 5 minutes just for this one thing, which just downloads files. Then you realize, okay, this is going to happen over and over as we continue to have more and more modules produced for probably a limited amount of problems that can be solved, except for building on top of, I've got a problem, my library is too complicated, I'll build another library on top of it to simplify it, which is exactly what this one does. There's another problem as well. If you actually go searching for something that you want to use, let's say we want to convert XML into JSON, which seems like quite a reasonable thing to do. The NPM search, I don't know if anyone's experienced it, but it's pretty awful. Basically just goes, let me try and find everything that includes any word that you've searched for. So if you search for one word, it's usually okay. If you search for 2 words, if you have a problem that involves 2 key words in the description of that problem, forget about it, it's not going to work. You're basically going to get every module that matches every word. And they're going to boost the things that match on those words. So if you filled your README full of those words, that's going to come up at the top. So it's kind of like we've gone back to the days of Alta Vista, searching through the internet. There's no real logic behind it. It's just you can keyword stuff your way to becoming the top search result for a particular query on NPM. They don't look at things like popularity or how many downloads are included. They just do a fairly plain text search. And Bower is even worse. I mean, I've got serious issues with Bower, which I'll get into a little bit later. But just looking at their search, we get the top result happens to have 2,000 stars on GitHub and mentions the word JSON and XML in the description. So obviously that is the best thing for my particular problem, even if it is just the countries of the world in XML and JSON format. So you can see my frustration. I come to a project, I want to solve a particular problem. I'm pretty sure someone's going to have written something which will help me get past that and actually get onto building the interesting part of the code for my project. But I'm struggling to find it because there's so many things. It's so hard to dig through. It's like back in the early days of the internet, once we got past the kind of the DMOZ directory of web pages, we can't possibly keep track of all of these different things. We need to actually get a little bit smart about how we search these things. One cheat way at the moment is you can actually just use Google to search these things and try not to use any of these site-specific searches at all. Or use Google with site:\domain name, and that works really well because Google's much better at indexing these sites than they are themselves. But I thought, rather than Choking to death. Don't film this. Can I speak? Yes, there we go. There, I lost it again. That one crisp. Okay, where was I? Oh yes, so the searches that I was trying to use to find things are terrible, sorry. So I thought, why don't I try and build a better search engine? Some way of finding things and boosting by, essentially, we have a good idea of the different ways that we can consider, is a library good? Should I spend my time investigating if I can actually use this thing? Can I programmatically collect all of that information together, combine it into a ranking that I can then use on a search across all of these different things that match the words that I'm looking for, and then show me the thing which looks like it's the best result? The question is, how do you know if a library is worth using? What kind of metrics do you look at? Or the heuristics of a project, if you're just glancing at it, to know, does this look good, without actually choking on it? Because we don't want to go through every project in a search result of, oh geez, of 150 different modules. We don't want to try each one out and go, no, this one isn't even anything related to it. This one doesn't work for these reasons. Ideally, we should be able to just get a couple of things which look like really good results that we can then go, right, well, it's actually worth my time trying these things out. So one good metric for that is documentation. Has the project actually been documented? This wipes out a load of projects. Anything that has no README, that has no description of anything about it, is basically just a name and maybe some keywords, not even potentially on NPM a link to a GitHub repo or any source code. It's a great way of going nope to any of those things, because if it's not documented, you're really going to struggle to be able to understand without actually literally reading the source code, which we're given a finite amount of time, we're not going to do that. Just going, okay, let's just look at projects that are documented in some form, and then let's consider those. Does it have an open source license? This is actually a really good, cheap way of working out if someone considered other people using their library. If they haven't put a license on it, they probably didn't think about other people wanting to be able to use their license, partly because they're not strictly allowed to use it. Just because your code is readable on GitHub doesn't mean that they've granted you permission to use it, which is tucked away neatly in the GitHub help section. It says in the terms and conditions that the copyright of the code, if there is no license, is owned by the person who published it, and that doesn't mean that you're allowed to use it necessarily. So if the project does have a license, it's a good indication that someone thought, well, maybe I should make this actually allowed that other people can use my code. So we can use the existence of an open source license as a signal that this might be good code without actually having to look at it. Is it popular? Now, popular is a quite broad term, especially when we come to look at software. Two things that I see a lot of people consider when they look at libraries is GitHub stars and downloads on things like NPM. Bower has no concept of downloads or anything, but we'll get onto that in a minute. And there's a problem with both of those. Can I get a hands up of anyone who's ever unstarred a project on GitHub? Wow, that's a lot more than I expected. Basically, no one ever unstars anything. So if you've starred something 5 years ago, if you were on GitHub back in the early days, then that star has the same weighting on that particular project, even though probably that person has completely moved on, forgot about that, or it's an incredibly popular project like Ruby on Rails that everyone stars anyway, and their value decays over time. But GitHub doesn't have a real good way of showing that. You literally have to download the stars for the project, look at when they were created, and then have them decay off over some kind of function of time. But I haven't really got time to do that manually at every project I look at. And it really doesn't tell you much about if the users are actually doing anything with those projects. Stars will tell you if a user aspires to use it or if they liked it because it was their friend's project. But it doesn't tell you if it's actually a very good library or not, unless you look at it as an order of magnitude kind of thing. So Bootstrap has something like 80,000 stars. If we did look at that on a logarithmic scale, that's what, maybe 5? So having something around the order of 10,000 stars is a good indication that that thing's okay. If it's only got 100 stars, then it's probably only used by a few people. But you can look at projects that have only existed for a few days and happen to be on Hacker News. Suddenly they've got 5,000 stars. Does that mean they're any good? Does it have long-term support? You can't really tell. So popular is a tricky one, and you have to take it with a grain of salt to be able to use that as a signal. But it is a signal as long as you consider it from a distance, rather than going like, this thing has some stars, therefore it must be good. And downloads as well, I mostly ignore, partly because it's really hard to keep a download count in sync with a number of different services, so technically I kind of ignored it, but also that CI systems will download modules repeatedly, especially inside internal companies where they're just running their CI systems all day long, bumping up the numbers. So they may be using one particular library that isn't particularly popular or useful, or it's their own library that they've published just because they wanted to put it on NPM, but they're downloading it every day, maybe 5, maybe 100 times, bumping those numbers up. That doesn't necessarily mean it's actually any good or it's worth your time looking at. So again, download numbers need to be taken with a pinch of salt. Also with NPM downloads, the download count will include everything in as a dependency. So if you've downloaded Express, and that depends on Connect, then a download count will be included for Express and Connect and all of Express's other counts. So the download counts are massively inflated by the dependency chain of downloads that NPM does. Is it under active development? Another good sign of, is it worth my time? Active development doesn't mean it's had a commit in the last day. Anything within the last year is probably a good sign that it's not completely dead. But at the same time, has it existed for more than a day? Is this project been around? Does it look like it's going to stay around? Is another good sign of, should I bother looking at this thing? If the project's not been touched in 4 years, we can probably assume it's dead. If it's in a language like Perl or something that doesn't move quite so fast, that's absolutely fine. If it's in a language like Go or Node where things are changing very rapidly, it's difficult to say a project that's 4 years old is actually going to run on the latest versions of the language, let alone work with all of the other dependencies which are still moving and building on top of new APIs. So we can use some amount of data about the date of the last kind of activity to give us an indication if this thing is any good or not. But ultimately, all of these things together don't quite make a whole picture and can often lead to false positives. But I found a metric which will actually give you a very good indication of if this thing is dependable. And it's basically built into the name. But first of all, let's just look at the algorithm made Google kind of become the de facto search engine of the world, which is PageRank. And PageRank looks at the number of links from a page to another page to determine its quality. So what they assume is the most popular, best websites on the internet are going to get a lot of links. And what we can do is swap that out with dependencies. So this only works, with a big caveat, for languages and package managers that have some kind of way of defining the dependencies of a project. Right now, for C projects, where the dependencies will often be written into makefiles in very unparsable ways, it doesn't really work. But for anything with a high-level package manager like NPM, RubyGems, Python, what's it called, PyPy, Packagist, this actually works really well because of the same kind of assumption. Libraries that are depended on a lot by other libraries should be dependable because other people depend on them. So, for example, if we look at how PageRank works with this funky smiley face diagram that I found on Google search, that loads of people point to the BBC, and the BBC is therefore considered to be a good quality site. If the BBC points to you, then it passes on a certain amount of its PageRank, because if a good site is linking to you, then you're considered to be a good site as well. And then what we can do is look at that in terms of NPM modules. The only thing here is I couldn't easily get rid of that circular dependency up there between Mocha and MakeDerp. That's imagine that little red arm isn't there, because otherwise you're going to get some kind of horrible pain of recursive downloading of NPM modules forevermore. But what we can look at here is we've got modules like Express, and which are depended on by lots and lots of different things. And Express depends on Mocha for its testing framework. It seems in the world of Node, almost everyone depends on Mocha for their testing. And then Mocha depends on MakeDerp. Actually, a lot of things depend on MakeDerp, but for example, it passes on a certain amount of its dependability to MakeDerp just because if this library is depended on by so many people and it depends on something, that thing must be at least reasonable for it to continue to operate. So, to be able to actually map the PageRank or source rank for, say, a whole package manager, NPM or RubyGems, you actually have to download all of the packages to be able to make those connections and pass out all the dependencies for each package so that you can see how all of the things interlink. And this is how the PageRank algorithm works, where it will sweep across in continual iterations of every link to every website and continually update the PageRank of websites as it finds more links and discovers more sites. Given that we know there is a finite amount of packages, it's slightly easier rather than Google, where it's like, every time I go look for new websites, there are more. At least we know that at one point in time there are only, say, 180,000 NPM modules. So I set about downloading every module possible. And I've ended up with, this was updated about 2 hours ago, so there's probably more now, but about nearly 950,000 different libraries, and this is across 29 different package managers and written in about 152 different programming languages, which is kind of insane. And this is being updated depending on the package manager and depending on how available they make their data, within 10 minutes, say for NPM and RubyGems that provide nice RSS feeds, and every 24 hours for ones that I have to scrape, like Maven and the Haskell package manager. Oh dear, I can't remember the name of that. But it's basically now going through and it's trying to collect all of that information and collate the dependency graphs of each package manager together. In some cases, even across multiple package managers where, say, for example, the Atom editor plugins that you can get actually depend on NPM modules. So you've got like a cross-contamination between package managers there, which was kind of hard to model in compared to all of the other ones. But it's building up a great picture of the whole of the world of open source and all of the libraries that depend on other libraries. So if we look at that search again, that on NPM comes up with some fairly poor results. The top result has 0 stars and very little information about it. If we look at the same result on libraries for a search, this is a little bit small, but we come up with almost an exact match name at the top, and the second result is definitely the one you want. So it still needs a little bit of tweaking, but it's certainly a lot better than the original search on NPM. It also allows you to then drill down by going, okay, well, I don't want any libraries that are written in CoffeeScript, for example, and you can also filter by license. So you could say, I don't want any copyleft licenses like the GPL, because the GPL license is infectious. If you depend on a GPL library, your library is then GPL. So if you're going to be potentially selling or relicensing your code, you might want to use only, say, permissive licenses like MIT or Apache. Then you can filter down using the library search. And this ranking is decided mostly by the same process that Google does for its pages, along with a few other signals for things that don't have any dependencies. It will then go and look for, does it have a README? Does it exist on GitHub? Does it have a license at all? Has it been updated recently? The other factors that I spoke about earlier, but the number one factor that is involved in ranking these things is based on how many things depend on this particular thing. We look at the Bower search, which was absolutely awful. We actually get back some really good results for the same kind of thing. It's exactly the same data set that Bower had, and all I had to do was just index, excuse me, that crisp again. All we had to do is index all the Bower packages, put it through the same algorithm, knowing that Bower packages will be depended on by other Bower packages, and knowing where to pass that out of the package manager. Bower doesn't really have any kind of central repository for all of this data, so it's just a case of spidering across all of the GitHub repos and reading all of the manifest files for it. But the search actually comes out to be really quite useful. So you can go fairly reliably, I can do a search and I can get back a number of things which look like they're going to be more useful that filter down what I'm going to work on top of. I literally I've been using libraries to search for libraries to add new functionality to libraries, which is kind of if you've got the project is able to support itself, then you're in a pretty good position, right? So as it goes around the internet collecting more and more information, so far it's adding about 1,000 brand new projects every day across all of the different package managers. A lot of those are on NPM. And then it also finds new versions of existing ones, because the dependencies don't necessarily always stay the same. When a new version is published, it may have a new dependency or it may take one away. So it has to then have a picture of all of the versions of every package as well. So for NPM, there's over 1 million different versions of every package that's been published. And libraries is finding a new 5,000 to 6,000 versions every day, which means I can basically collect a huge amount of information about any particular open source project. I don't want to call it big data because I can still fit the database on my hard drive and load it into RAM, so it's really like medium data. But you can pull out some really interesting things. This is a project page that I've essentially started to collate and to try and make a useful project page that gives you more information than any, or it collects the best bits from different package managers and the way that they display things. So we've got probably the most useful thing is the project statistics. This is for one of my favorite libraries, Johnny 5. I'm sure Adam's used this before. It lets you do all kinds of awesome hardware hacking without really having to understand the hardware going on underneath. It gives you really nice high-level APIs for it. So it's got this magical number that I call source rank, very similar to the page rank number. It just doesn't have a limit of 10. It goes up slightly more because of the other factors that are involved. I think the highest one is Mocha out of 900,000 projects, and that has a source rank of about 24 right now. It's really poorly described. I'm a terrible person, but it gives you all of the factors underneath it, which are the numbers that go into that. So we can see the number of dependencies that a project has. If that project had 200 dependencies, that might raise your eyebrow. The number of projects that depend on that. So that's other libraries that depend directly on top of that. Dependent repositories are any GitHub repository that's pointing, saying in its package JSON, I use Johnny 5. The number of releases gives you a good indication that it's actually fairly active, and it was only updated like 18 hours ago, but it's been around for 3 years, so that's a fairly good sign that this is a good, reliable project. Plus a few GitHub stats that it's pulling in, and the size of the repo, not particularly useful, but if it's massive, it's a good flag to just go, I don't know if I really want to clone that right now. Also, as I'm indexing everything, I'm putting it into Elasticsearch, which has this really cool function called more like this. And so I'm able to pull out projects that look like this particular module. So this is available for all projects, and it varies based on how good the description of a particular project is and how many keywords they've used to describe things. But it's a useful way of kind of having that Wikipedia-like bounce around and find something that is, this thing looks like it's almost right, but is there something that is close to it that I can find an alternative without having to go and know exactly what to search for. And probably the most useful feature is that it has release notifications. So as it collects all of these new versions, you can subscribe to say, tell me about new versions of this particular thing. So for example, Express or Johnny 5, I can just say, send me an email when there's a new version published, or subscribe to the RSS feed. So there's an RSS feed of every release, as well as being able to click back through any particular release and look at the information and the README for that particular version. This is something that NPM recently removed from their website. I have no idea why, but you can no longer view information about any version other than the latest version, which can be incredibly frustrating sometimes if you're trying to rather than literally download every version and manually look through the source code, to be able to see, what happened here in this previous version. Okay, so I've also got some beta features that I thought I would share as stuff that I've been working on, and I'm happy to say after working on this for in my spare time for about 4 hours a week. This week, I'm now working full-time on libraries to try and bootstrap it into an actual product/company thing. And so all of the bits that I'm going to show now are half-baked or not really ready for public consumption, but are the kind of interesting future of where I think we can get some interesting improvements for the world of open source on top of it. So right now, libraries, all of the things I've spoken about are looking at the dependency, excuse me, the libraries that depend on a given library. But actually, there's a whole world of applications that depend on those libraries as well. So it doesn't necessarily give you the whole picture unless you actually can index all of the world's software, not just all of the world's libraries. So I started to do that. So far I've written manifest parsers for, these logos aren't particularly descriptive sometimes. There's, I think this one down here is the Dart one, NPM, Ruby Gems, Rust, which is their package manager is called Cargo. Essentially a load of the different manifest files. So this is like package.json, but for all of the different package managers across different languages. And then given a Git repo, excuse me, it's able to find the dependencies for that particular application, index those, and then put that towards the source rank for a particular thing as well. So whether if you just look at the page rank / source rank for a particular library based on other libraries, that tends towards very low level libraries that lots of other libraries build on top of. Not necessarily end user libraries that you're only going to use in your Express app, but other libraries are not going to build on top of. If we can actually look at all the open source GitHub applications that use that particular library, we can get a better picture of what things are useful for end user developers as well as other library developers, if that makes sense. Another interesting thing we can do is then, given a GitHub repo, we can actually watch all of the dependencies for that particular thing. So this is the main piece of work that I've been building. You can essentially log in with your GitHub account. It will download and parse all of the repositories, either just your public repos or your public and private repos, pull out all of the dependencies across all different manifests that you have in that particular thing. So it can find everything in your package.json, your Bower, oh God, is it still called Bower.json or is it called component.json? I don't know. Your gem file, your requirements.txt for Python, and then you can essentially say, subscribe me to notifications of new releases for all of those things. If you hit the watch button on a particular repo, it will then put a webhook on GitHub, and it will be notified every time you push to master, and it will then go, you've added a new dependency in this push. I'll start telling you if there's new releases of that thing, or you've removed, I've got this in text form. You've removed a dependency here, so there's no need for me to tell you about new releases on that. And new releases are just the start. What I then like to be able to do, and I found some information about it, I'm still working on it, is to be able to then tell you about security vulnerabilities across the dependencies in your applications, but automatically. So if you've added a new NPM module in as a dependency, to be able to go, we've just noticed that there's a security vulnerability in something that depends on, like, you should probably either update it or remove it or patch it. And if you removed it or you fixed it, then it would stop telling you about that security notification because it's getting notified every time you push to your Git repos. So this is already monitoring libraries. So I can use libraries to find out when libraries needs its libraries updating, which is pretty awesome. Again, it's able to track itself. Right now, it just tells me about new versions and sends me an email whenever, say, there's a new version of, this is a Rails app, so tell me about a new version of Ruby on Rails, but I also track a lot of my open source projects with it because then I'm able to easily go through and go, right, well, I need to update this thing on these 3 Nodecopter projects that I'm using. So I've not let really anyone in to use this yet, but as you've all kindly listened to me yabber on about it, you can actually access this right now for free, either on your public open source projects or on all your private and public GitHub repos by just going to libraries.io/dashboard and logging in with your GitHub account. And this will essentially be able to give you notifications for any new versions of dependencies across any of your projects that use one of these package managers. Right now, there's another 18 more package managers I need to write parsers for, for different languages, but I've covered the bases, I think. And there's some more things that I'm planning to add to it. It's going to be completely free for open source forever, and then there'll be paid plans for private repos at different levels, essentially. The more repos you have, the more expensive it'll be, including security vulnerability notifications, so automatically able to tell you when, say, there's an issue with Express. Here are all your repos that are using Express around that version, so you need to update those things. And for anyone who's working in a fairly large corporate, I can also check the licensing issues amongst the stack of dependencies. So say, for example, a dependency that you're using changes from being MIT to switching to GPL. Your lawyers are not going to like that, because suddenly all of your code has become GPL, which, if you're then selling that on, potentially puts you in all kinds of sticky situations. Or that you're actually depending on code that has not been licensed at all, which again, the lawyers are going to be like, I don't really like that. We're not legally allowed to do any of this thing. As well as better notifications. At the moment, it'll only send emails, but I'm working on integration so you can get notified in your Slack room or Gitter, and also be able to open up GitHub issues automatically to go, there's a new version of this, or there's a security vulnerability in that. So it'll kind of be like your little helpful robot that will tell you, here's something that you should do. But rather than you having to manually check it, because especially with projects that have lots of dependencies, it becomes a huge amount of work to manually check all of these things. As a side effect of collecting all this information about all these GitHub repos, you can also pull out some cool things which actually build on top of and kind of improve what GitHub already has. So I'm able to show you, for any given user, all of the repositories that they've contributed to, not just the top 5, as well as then looking through all of their projects and going, okay, what are the things that they use the most? So Rick Waldron, who's the creator of Johnny 5, uses Grunt all over the place. So you can go now, if you logged in with your GitHub, it will pull down, and if it probably has found you already, just because it's been spidering GitHub for a few months now. But if you log in, it will ensure that the information is completely up to date, and you can actually see the projects that are you use the most, as well as kind of going back through time and remembering all the projects that you've contributed to on GitHub that maybe you've forgotten about. And I'm hoping to eventually use that information to build a recommendation engine to go, here are some things based on, you like to use these node modules, here are some other node modules that are useful. Another way that we can use the data is to try and help and improve the world of open source by pointing out areas where, if you want to contribute to open source, then here's an effective place to do it. So the bus factor page was an experiment to go, given the projects that are depended on the most, which ones have very few people that are actively maintaining them? So you can filter by language here, and it will essentially show you, here are the projects that thousands of people depend on their code, and there's one guy actually has commit access to this thing. The bus factor, basically, if you haven't heard of it before, is how many people need to get hit by a bus to kill the project. Maybe also kill or hurt, maim the developer involved. But, or even just, you could swap it out with the burnout factor. If the maintainer of that has become sick of maintaining that particular piece of software, yes, that works for me, Adam, then that could freeze in time. Security vulnerability updates may not happen. So if you're thinking about trying to contribute to a particular project, the bus factor page can give you a place to go, here's where I can be really effective with my time. If you've only got a few hours of a week to put into open source and you want to give back, and you want to have a big impact, then we can actually use libraries to point you at places that need help, rather than just, say, Bootstrap, where there's more than enough people contributing to that. And as a this is the most new thing, I think, and it's really crappy right now, but it actually lets you explore GitHub in ways that GitHub won't let you explore. Disclaimer, I used to work at GitHub on the explore section. I don't anymore, mostly because they said GitHub Explore isn't important right now, which is partly why this page exists, because I think it's important, and so I left to be able to build things like this. Basically, this having indexed most of GitHub's open source things lets you drill down and view interesting projects in different ways. So you can drill down by language and see the most forked, most starred, new projects or recently pushed projects, I think. And you can also filter by license as well. So, and this is just the start. I hope to be able to go show me projects that have been updated recently, or to actually start pulling out keywords and allow it to be grouped together, to go show me all of the database related projects that are written in CoffeeScript and are licensed with MIT, so that you can actually, if you're not exactly sure what you're looking for, you can drill down in different ways and explore the data and slice it up in ways that you wouldn't otherwise be able to. And that's basically all of that I've got about libraries, and I've got a few tips and tricks related to that I've kind of found out as I've drilled down into these different open source things that I thought I'd share. So as we get to the point of there being so many libraries, if you're thinking of building a library, you actually need to kind of consider, I hate to use the term SEO, but it literally is search engine optimization, but not like horrible keyword spammy kind of people. Although I am going to tell you to spam your projects with keywords. Literally, we can take leaves out of SEO consultants' books to ensure that your libraries get more people and more eyeballs by following basically the same things. Make sure you actually use the name of the technology or the problem that you're solving in at least the description or the name of your library. The GitHub search will not find you if you don't use the word in the description or the title. It just won't be, people won't be able to discover it. So if you shorten it, say the Google Web Toolkit, if you actually just use GWT, someone search for Google Web Toolkit, they're not going to find you. So use the descriptive words. It seems simple, but a lot of people make mistakes where they don't think about how people would actually go about searching for these things. Make sure you actually link the data together. Libraries only really works well if it can find the source code for your project as well. If it can find a homepage or something like that, they can go actually spidering through. If you just publish an NPM module with no information on it, it's very hard to work out what's going on here. Make sure you add a license so people can use your code, and consider what license you're going to use. If you want it to be copyleft, then people will actively not use your library, say, especially in any kind of mobile development, because Apple don't allow GPL code to be legally published in the App Store. So that's something to consider. Front load your README. Basically, you should have almost every bit of documentation you need in your README, because most people are going to judge your project based on a quick scan of your README. Does this README tell me enough to get started? If not, then I'm kind of going to move on to something else. And increase the bust factor. Like, don't just have one person working on your project. Try and get more people to help you out, so that your project doesn't look like it's literally just you, and that if you got hit by a bus, then the project would die, because no one wants to depend on a project that could potentially die when you're walking across the street. Or if you cycle in Bristol at rush hour, which seems absolutely mental. Few NPM tips. Make sure you use shrink wrap. Now, shrink wrap used to be really, really crap. It's got much better recently, and with the amount of different modules and the amount of different levels of dependency trees that move around, every time you run npm install, you could potentially get many different dependencies come in as a new version is published. make sure you upgrade to 3.0. It's in beta right now, but it's pretty stable. And that actually ensures that every time you do run npm install, you do get the same things, which sounds ridiculous, but in before 3.0, if you run npm install twice after removing your node modules folder, you're not guaranteed to get the same thing twice, which is kind of scary. If you're building a library and you're depending on other things, then use assembler range to say, like, it's okay for us to use, say, 1.x or 1.1.x rather than specifying a particular version unless the thing is broken everywhere else, because it allows more people to essentially, especially with NPM 3, which tries to flatten your dependency tree, it allows more people to ensure that they can fit it in with their dependencies. But for your applications, if you're not using shrink wrap, you should probably specify an exact version for the dependencies that you're using to ensure that other people can't break your application. I've been bitten by this a number of times when having an auto-scaled application or an application that runs on CI that does npm install in part of the CI process, is that a new version could be published somewhere that matches your range and essentially will break everything automatically whilst you weren't even paying attention. If it's auto-scaling up and making your making new machines as it finds those dependencies don't work, that machine can't handle traffic, it's going to scale up a new machine which is broken as well. So shrink wrap or specifying exact versions can be it can be a lifesaver without you realizing necessarily, and it's that very small percentage chance that could happen that you really want to avoid. Handy little thing for if you're publishing modules, you can use npm version patch or bump or major or minor, and it will move a number for you automatically in your package JSON, tag in Git a particular version, and then you can just do npm publish and it will take care of bumping the numbers up for you rather than you having to do that all manually, which is pretty handy. And you can also just install Git repos directly using npm. I only found this out today. You can do npm install org name / repo name, and that will bypass npm's registry completely. If you want to try something out, you can just install it straight from GitHub. It will get the master, latest version, but you can put a hash on the end and get a particular commit or branch as well. And make sure in your applications you set private to true in your package JSON to ensure you don't accidentally publish it to npm. You'd think that most people wouldn't do that, but I get almost daily emails asking me to remove npm modules from libraries.io where someone's accidentally published their source code to npm. And of course, libraries has found it within 10 minutes, indexed it, and then Google has indexed that. And so then it shows up on the homepage for the JavaScript GitHub repos. There's a new one, yay! It's this guy's private code. Usually the emails include, I would get fired if you can't remove this. So all you have to do, make sure you just set private to true, and npm won't let you publish if it notices that flag. Bower? So not much tips there. I put that slide in earlier today, and then around lunchtime I noticed this tweet which says, as a member of the Bower team, please go and read this article. I was like, oh, okay. And the article literally says, stop using Bower. The maintainers of Bower are like, don't think you should really be using it anymore. Bower is essentially a glorified curl and a URL shortener from a GitHub name to a single name without the slash. It doesn't really give you much else other than that. It doesn't ever take a snapshot of a particular version. It essentially takes all the lessons learned from previous package managers and throws them out the window, and will cause you no end of trouble after a very easy initial setup you think, that's great. I can just do Bower install jQuery. It's all good. And then later you do Bower install something else, and it goes, I depend on a different version of jQuery than you've currently got. So what are we going to do?
Sounds like you get a couple of years ago.
Yes, very similar. There's a number of package managers which seem to have not kind of got far enough. Basically, CPAN solved all of these problems with Perl a very long time ago, and everyone should be copying them. But Bower seems to have stopped after the first initial Bower install. If you do happen to be stuck using it, there are a few actual tips rather than just don't use it. But I would suggest trying to essentially lock it down so that bad things can't happen. It might sound crazy, but you should probably commit your Bower components into source control, because like old NPM, if you do Bower install again, you don't necessarily get the same thing, because Bower takes the head of every Git repo that it knows about. And so if there's a new commit to master, which doesn't necessarily, for a lot of projects, mean actually released, actually working, or anything, like CI runs off master, so CI is going to test that when they've pushed it, and it doesn't mean that the GitHub repo even exists anymore. When you publish something, anyone can publish anything to Bower. You can do Bower install Linux, and that will get you the Linux kernel, but I wouldn't advise putting that in the browser. But at the same time, anyone can then also remove GitHub repos. Bower doesn't know about that. It will go, sorry, 404 on that thing that you used to depend on, but you can't use that anymore. Way of getting around that on GitHub is to actually fork libraries, fork any library that you depend on onto your own GitHub org. So if it does get removed, then it will remain on your account, unless it's a private library. But let's not talk about that. And that will freeze it in time as well. So you know that thing's always going to stay the same. But if you're doing that, you may as well put it into your application, or even just a lot of the time with front-end JavaScript libraries, you can probably just put the single JavaScript file in there. Also, quite a good idea to run Bower prune on a regular basis if you are updating things, which will wipe out anything that you're no longer using but don't necessarily realize, as Bower likes to make a mess. But I suggest actually looking at things like Webpack, JSPM, or Browserify if you really do want to have a strong kind of programmatically driven setup for your front-end components. But that is another talk I think Adam has scheduled for October, maybe. So that's about all I've got.